Hello, everyone. I'll be sharing with you the upcoming Sunday school lesson for March the 5th. This begins a new unit of study, a new quarterly. If you have not gotten a quarterly, I invite you to go by the church and pick up what you need. The lessons for the month of March are called from the Margins of Society. The lesson for this coming Sunday comes from Luke chapter 15. Specifically, it details the parable that we often call the parable of the prodigal or the parable of the lost son. As I said, all the lessons for the month of March will revolve around the theme of the marginalized in society. Now, we know that Jesus regularly hung around with those whom the religious elites avoided. In his teachings, he did the same. He told stories about the marginalized, such as the poor man Lazarus and the rich man who was called Dives. The parable of the Good Samaritan was a parable about the marginalized. Think about it. Would you hang out with or even try to help lepers, prostitutes, money launderers, etc.? Maybe not, but Jesus did all the time. In Luke chapter 15, we have three parables that speak on the theme of lostness. This is a trilogy of parables, and let's take a moment and look at the context of these parables. Let me read verses 1 and 2 for you. Verse 1 says, "All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him." Think about that. There was an audience that wanted to hear Jesus, to learn from him. This was the audience of the marginalized. Verse 2, "And the Pharisees and scribes were complaining. This man," referring to Jesus, "welcomes sinners and eats with them." You see, the religious elites were also there, but they did not really want to hear from Jesus or to learn from him. The first parable, the parable about the lost sheep. It's the one where the shepherd has 100 sheep. He loses one. The question, will he leave the 99 to search out and find the one who was lost? And the answer is yes, he will. He does. The point is how God rejoices over one sinner who repents, and upon repenting of sin, enters the kingdom of God. Parable number 2 is about the lost coin. A woman sweeps and cleans her whole house until she finds this precious coin, a silver coin, and maybe that coin would have paid for groceries for a week or a month. When she finds it, she is so happy, she is so excited that she calls her neighbors and friends so that they might rejoice with her that her coin has been found. In the same way, there's joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. Parable number 3 is about the lost son. This is the parable for your lesson for today. Often, this lost son is called the prodigal. The parable, as found in your lesson book, covers verses 11 to 24, but the whole parable covers verses 11 to 32. And so I would encourage you to read the whole parable about the lost son or the prodigal. So if you want the complete picture of forgiveness and reconciliation, you will indeed need to read the whole story. But if you go back to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15, the two audiences, you could say that the first audience, referring to the tax collectors and sinners, was represented by the younger son in the story, the one who got into trouble, much, much trouble. And then the second audience, referring to the Pharisees and scribes, were represented by the older son, the hardcore legalist. In this parable, Jesus was hitting two birds with one stone. Also, before I get into my interpretation of this parable, I would like to direct you to page 10 of the Learner's Guide. Paragraphs 2 and 3 provide a necessary understanding of this word, prodigal, again, a word that we don't use too regularly in conversation. We usually associate the word prodigal with wasteful. Wasteful. Certainly the younger son was wasteful, extremely so. It would be hard to imagine anyone more wasteful of money and life opportunities. However, The other definition of prodigal is lavish or extravagant. This definition would fit the father. Giving the younger son his inheritance and letting him potentially ruin his life was an extreme decision. His gift was lavish and extravagant. We might also call it foolish. Perhaps the prodigal in the story, if we use that word prodigal, was both the youngest son and the father. Today, I want to talk with you about 3 topics, and the first is estate planning. Now, maybe you have done estate planning for you and your family. I know that I have. I know that my wife did with her family. But if you have not, I would highly, highly recommend it. We should not have money secrets in our family. Transfer of wealth should be done orderly and properly and legally. At least get your best tax advice. Usually the transfer of wealth does not officially happen until the father and mother die. Also, usually by that time, the recipients of the estate are older and wiser and will make good decisions with their portions of the estate. Sometimes the will, referring to the last will and testament, defines the estate such that it will specify that Junior cannot access any assets until an appropriate age. Most 18-year-olds will not make great decisions about money. In this parable, based upon societal norms over 2,000 years ago, the oldest son would receive 2/3 of the estate, the double portion. The younger son would receive 1/3 of the estate. In this parable, the younger son demands his share of 1/3. Surprisingly, shockingly, the father grants the request. Surely the father knew the dangers of a young man with more money than he had sense. Predictably, the younger son wasted his fortune, his share of his estate. He made very bad decisions, virtually every kind of bad decision a young man could make. He, quote, squandered the wealth in wild and riotous living, verse 13. He played rather than worked. He spent rather than saved. He chose friends who were not friends. It wasn't long before he was broke. The first shoe had dropped, and the second shoe dropped in the form of a famine. The second theme is need and famine. The young man was in need, verse 14. This meant that he was hungry, dirty, smelly, destitute. He had become a homeless man. Picture that, a homeless young man. In desperation, he took the only job available, feeding pigs, tending swine. That was not a great job for a Jewish young man. When I was a kid, we had feeder pigs. It was my job to feed them. Sometimes we cleaned out the nasty concrete floor they walked on, and which they did about everything else on as well. Let me just say it was nasty work. Most of the time, however, our pigs fed off of the roughage found in the fields after harvest, particularly the cornfields. Basically, our pigs ate pretty well. It wasn't too long before each of our pigs weighed about 200 pounds and they were ready to sell. In this parable, the young man had reached a point where he was constantly hungry. He, quote, longed to eat what the pigs were eating. Now that is truly desperation. I cannot ever imagine to want to eat or be willing to eat what pigs are eating. Sometimes we don't look up or turn to God until we are truly desperate. Sometimes we have to hit rock bottom in life before we realize that in our failure, we need God physically and spiritually. Fortunately, this young man did not give up or check out of life. He did have one alternative, and that alternative was home. He could still try to go home. And the third theme is the journey home. Now, one of my favorite people is Dave Ramsey. I don't know him personally, but I have learned much from him. He is known for Financial Peace University, for his books, and his YouTube broadcasts. For me, personally, I watch some, maybe one or two, of his 7 to 8 minute video YouTube teachings about every week. Seriously. The reason that Dave Ramsey teaches to help others financially is because when he was a young man, he was the prodigal financially. Now, he had made his first million. He was doing all kinds of wheeling and dealing in real estate, and then the real estate market collapsed. He went bankrupt. He went from being a millionaire to penniless almost overnight. That broke him financially, spiritually. It humiliated him. It changed him. His journey was finding a better path for himself, which has led to him helping hundreds of thousands of other people find a better path as well. Doing his plan requires discipline, but it works. Let me ask you a question. Do you think it was easy for the young man to swallow his pride and walk home? Well, the answer is no, but at least he did. Some of us do not. We let pride keep us away from ever finding home, and ultimately, this home is with God and Jesus. God bless. May you have a great week.